In August 1990, the quiet college town of Gainesville, Florida, became the center of one of the most terrifying murder sprees in American history. Danny Harold Rolling, a drifter with a violent past, stalked the city's students as they prepared for the fall semester. Over the course of just 4 days, he broke into apartments in the dead of night, attacking young men and women in their beds. By the end of that week, 5 students were dead, brutally murdered, mutilated, and posed in ways so disturbing that even seasoned investigators were left shaken. The killings sparked mass panic. Thousands of students fled campus, barricaded themselves in their dorms, or armed themselves with weapons, fearing they might be next. Rolling would become known as the Gainesville Ripper, his crimes forever linked to the shattered sense of safety in a town built on youth and promise. But the story doesn't end there. Rolling's life had been shaped by violence long before Gainesville. An abusive childhood, failed relationships, and a string of crimes paved the path to his murderous rampage. When he was finally caught, it wasn't for the killings but for a burglary that led police straight to him. In time, DNA evidence tied him to the murders, and Rolling himself admitted not only to the Gainesville slayings, but to a triple homicide in Shreveport, Louisiana, the year before. He was sentenced to death in 1994. For 12 years, he sat on Florida's death row, writing songs, poems, and even a handwritten confession that surfaced just before his execution. On his final day, Rolling ordered a last meal of lobster tail. When asked if he had any final words, he didn't apologize, nor did he mention his victims. Instead, he softly sang a gospel hymn he had written, repeating the words, "None greater than thee, O Lord, none greater than thee." At 6:13 p.m. on October 25, 2006, the Gainesville Ripper was pronounced dead by lethal injection. To understand how Danny Rolling's life of violence escalated into one of Florida's darkest chapters, and how the man who terrorized the city faced his own end singing, we have to go back to the beginning. But first, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell, because this isn't just the story of a serial killer. It's the story of 5 young lives stolen, a community haunted, and justice carried out in the most final way possible. Danny Harold Rolling was born on May 26, 1954, in Shreveport, Louisiana, into a home that was anything but safe. His father, James Rolling, was a decorated police officer, but behind closed doors he was known for his violent temper and iron-fisted control. Danny's childhood was defined by cruelty. He endured constant beatings, verbal abuse, and humiliation from a father who seemed to despise him simply for existing. His mother, Claudia, tried to shield her son, but she too lived in fear, trapped in a toxic marriage where leaving never seemed like an option. Danny grew up feeling unwanted, unloved, and powerless, conditions that would shape the man he became. As a boy, Danny found little escape. He struggled in school, often described by teachers as withdrawn and restless. He tried to seek comfort in art and music, picking up the guitar as a teenager, but his father mocked him, insisting he would never amount to anything. Each attempt to carve out a normal life was met with rejection, violence, or ridicule. By his teenage years, Danny began acting out. He was caught stealing, breaking into homes, and committing petty crimes, not just for money, but as a way to feel some sense of control over a world that had taken everything from him. His brushes with the law quickly became a pattern. Arrests turned into probation, probation into stints in jail. Danny Rolling drifted through life, unable to hold down steady work. He tried jobs as a waiter, a laborer, even short-lived attempts at a normal family life. He married, had a daughter, but his violent tendencies, likely learned from his father, destroyed his marriage, leaving him more isolated than ever. Every failure, every rejection, pushed him deeper into anger and despair. Instead of turning away from violence, Danny seemed to lean into it, allowing bitterness and rage to become the driving forces of his life. Throughout his 20s and 30s, Rolling moved from town to town, leaving behind a trail of burglaries, robberies, and broken relationships. He spent time in prison, cycling in and out of the system, but he never truly reformed. Each release only gave him another chance to spiral further. By 1990, Danny was a man on the edge, homeless, drifting through Florida, carrying with him not just his belongings, but a lifetime of unresolved trauma and explosive anger. And it was in Gainesville, Florida, that those demons he had carried since childhood would finally explode, unleashing a wave of unspeakable violence that would leave 5 young students dead and a community forever haunted. August 1990. Gainesville, Florida. A picturesque college town known for its lively student culture was preparing to welcome thousands of students for the fall semester. Parents said their goodbyes, students decorated dorm rooms, and a new academic year was just beginning. But within 72 hours, the atmosphere of promise and excitement would be shattered. Gainesville would become the setting for one of the most horrifying killing sprees in American history, and its residents would find themselves living in paralyzing fear of a predator who struck in the dead of night. The horror began on August 24th, when 2 roommates, Christina Powell, just 17 years old, and Sonia Larson, 18, were found murdered in their off-campus apartment. Christina and Sonia had only recently moved in, excited to start their studies and begin their adult lives. Instead, their home became the first crime scene of a nightmare. Both young women had been attacked with a knife as they slept, and Rowling's signature brutality became immediately evident. Their bodies were left posed, deliberately staged in ways that showed the killer's need for control and domination. Only a day later, on August 25th, police were called to another grisly discovery. Krista Hoyt, an 18-year-old Santa Fe Community College student, failed to show up for her night shift at the Sheriff's Office Records Department, where she worked part-time. Officers went to check on her, and what they found would haunt even the most seasoned investigators. Krista had been brutally murdered in her small duplex. Rowling not only killed her, he mutilated her body and then arranged it in a grotesque, ritualistic pose. In a chilling act of cruelty, he decapitated Krista and positioned her head on a shelf, forcing anyone who entered to confront the full extent of his sadism. This shocking level of violence made it clear that Gainesville was facing not just a killer, but a predator with a methodical and terrifying pattern. By the time August 27th arrived, fear had already begun spreading across Gainesville. But Rowling wasn't finished. That morning, the bodies of Tracy Poles, age 23, and her roommate, Manuel Tawada, also 23, were discovered in their apartment. Manuel, who was athletic and strong, fought back against the intruder, but Rowling overpowered and killed him. He then turned his attention to Tracy, subjecting her to the same brutal fate as his previous victims. Their deaths brought the toll to 5 innocent young lives in just 3 days, each crime scene echoing the same ritual of violence and control. The pattern was unmistakable. Danny Rowling broke into apartments in the pre-dawn hours, targeting students as they slept. He carried a Marine-style K-bar knife, and his attacks were swift, brutal, and deeply personal. But it wasn't just about killing. Rowling took time to stage the bodies afterward, almost as if he wanted the world to see his work, to understand the twisted fantasies that drove him. These weren't random acts of violence. They were carefully orchestrated displays of power, cruelty, and obsession. As word of the murder spread, Gainesville descended into chaos. Students who had been unpacking boxes days earlier now dragged mattresses into living rooms, sleeping in groups for safety. Others armed themselves with baseball bats, knives, even firearms, terrified that they could be next. Parents flooded the campus with frantic phone calls, begging their children to come home. Some students did just that, abandoning classes and fleeing the city altogether. Stores sold out of locks, alarms, and pepper spray. Gainesville, once a place of youthful optimism, became a town living under siege. Within days, the story exploded across the nation. Television crews descended on Gainesville, turning the city into the epicenter of a media storm. Headlines screamed of the Gainesville Ripper. Reporters recounted each gruesome detail, fueling a climate of hysteria. For residents, it was as if the world had collapsed around them. The sense of safety that had defined their community was gone, replaced with the chilling reality that a serial killer was moving silently among them. The city waited in fear for police to catch the monster responsible. But what they didn't know was that Danny Harold Rolling was already on the run, drifting from place to place, hiding in the woods outside town, and preparing to strike again. His capture would come not through a dramatic chase, but through a simple burglary arrest that would unravel the mystery of Gainesville's darkest summer. Police didn't catch Danny Rolling immediately. After the murders in Gainesville, he disappeared into the shadows, living out of a campsite hidden deep in the woods just outside the city. There, investigators would later discover a twisted shrine of evidence: audio tapes, journals, and personal belongings stolen from his victims. But while Gainesville was locked in fear, Rolling was already moving on, blending into new towns and continuing his cycle of crime. It wasn't until weeks later, through sheer chance, that authorities finally placed him in custody. Not for murder, but for something far less dramatic. On September 7th, 1990, police in Ocala, Florida, arrested Rolling for an unrelated burglary. He had broken into a supermarket and was caught attempting to steal food and cash. To officers at the time, he looked like just another drifter with a rap sheet, a man with a history of theft, robbery, and prison time. He was booked and locked away without anyone realizing that the so-called Gainesville Ripper was already behind bars. For months, the investigation into the Gainesville murders continued. Detectives pored over crime scene evidence, desperate to connect the dots. The case took a major turn when DNA technology, still relatively new at the time, came into play. Biological evidence left at the crime scenes was compared to Rolling's DNA. The results were undeniable. Between 1991 and 1993, tests confirmed that the man sitting in prison for burglary was in fact the killer who had terrorized Gainesville. It was the breakthrough investigators had been waiting for. By the time the case went to trial, the mountain of evidence was overwhelming. Rather than face a jury that would hear every grisly detail, Danny Rolling chose to admit the truth. In January 1994, he stood before a Florida courtroom and pleaded guilty to 5 counts of first-degree murder. His confession shocked the room, not because anyone doubted his guilt, but because of the calm, almost casual way he acknowledged his crimes. He offered no excuses, no denials, only acceptance that he had taken the lives of Christina Powell, Sonia Larson, Krista Hoyt, Tracy Poles, and Manuel Tabawada. But Rolling's admissions didn't end there. In a chilling twist, he also confessed to another set of murders, 3 unsolved killings that had haunted his hometown of Shreveport, Louisiana. On November 4th, 1989, just 9 months before the Gainesville spree, 55-year-old William Grissom, his 24-year-old daughter Julie, and her 8-year-old nephew Sean were brutally murdered in their home. The crime had puzzled investigators for years, but now the truth was out. Danny Rolling had slaughtered the family, leaving behind the same signature violence and staging that Gainesville would later witness. Rolling's confession linked him to a total of 8 murders, finally revealing the full extent of his killing spree. For investigators, it was a moment of grim closure. For the families of the victims, it was the beginning of a painful journey through the courts. And for Danny Rolling, it was the final step toward a fate that had already been sealed, a death sentence that would one day be carried out in Florida's execution chamber. With the guilty pleas entered and his past atrocities laid bare, the next phase of Danny Rolling's story would unfold inside a courtroom, where prosecutors sought the ultimate punishment and jurors were forced to confront the darkest corners of human cruelty. In April 1994, after years of investigations, hearings, and mounting anticipation, Danny Harold Rolling faced his ultimate judgment in a Florida courtroom. He had already pleaded guilty to the murders, sparing the victims' families the agony of a lengthy trial filled with gruesome details. But the sentencing phase was a trial of its own, as jurors were tasked with answering a question that would determine the rest of Rolling's life. Should this man be sentenced to death? For 10 days, the courtroom became a stage where grief, anger, psychology, and morality collided. The prosecution painted a chilling portrait of Rolling's crimes. They meticulously walked the jury through each of the 5 Gainesville murders, how Christina Powell and Sonia Larson had been attacked as they slept, how Krista Hoyt had been decapitated and posed, how Manuel Tabawada had fought bravely to defend his roommate Tracy Poles before both were killed. Each victim's story was laid bare, not as statistics, but as young lives stolen in the most brutal ways imaginable. Prosecutors emphasized the cruelty, the calculated staging of bodies, and the sheer terror Rolling brought to Gainesville. To them, there was no question these crimes deserved the ultimate punishment. The defense, however, urged the jury to look deeper into Danny Rolling's past. They spoke of his abusive childhood, how he grew up under the shadow of a violent and domineering father who beat him, berated him, and broke down his spirit from the time he was a boy. They brought in psychologists who testified that Rolling suffered from multiple mental illnesses, antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality traits, and a lifetime of unresolved trauma. They argued that Danny was not born a monster, but made into one, molded by years of abuse, neglect, and rejection. For the defense, this was not an excuse, but a plea for mercy, a call to spare his life and sentence him instead to life in prison without parole. Then came the most emotional moments of the trial, the testimony of the victims' families. Mothers, fathers, siblings, and friends stood before the court to share the pain Rolling had inflicted. They spoke of lives full of promise, of daughters who dreamed of becoming doctors, of sons who were loyal and kind, of futures ripped away in acts of senseless violence. Their voices cracked with grief as they demanded justice, their tears filling the silence of the courtroom. These impact statements were powerful, not just for the jury, but for the nation watching from afar. They reminded everyone that behind the sensational headlines were real people, real families, and wounds that would never fully heal. The media, which had been captivated by the case since 1990, descended on Gainesville once more. Headlines branded Rolling as the Gainesville Ripper, a name that would follow him forever. News outlets broadcast live from outside the courthouse, their coverage feeding a public both horrified and fascinated by the man on trial. Inside Florida and across the country, the case reignited debates over the death penalty, serial killers, and the justice system's ability to protect the innocent. Yet for Gainesville residents, the focus wasn't philosophical. It was deeply personal. This was their city, their university, their children who had been killed. And many felt only one sentence could balance the scales. After days of testimony, arguments, and emotional appeals, the jury reached its decision. They unanimously recommended the death penalty. The judge, agreeing with their verdict, pronounced Danny Rolling's sentence, death by lethal injection. In that moment, the man who had terrorized Gainesville students was officially condemned. Families in the courtroom wept, some in relief, others in sorrow, while Rolling himself sat quietly, showing little visible reaction as his fate was sealed. With the trial over, Danny Rolling was transferred to Florida's death row, where he would spend the next 12 years awaiting his execution. But those years would not be silent. From behind bars, Rolling began to write, sing, and even confess more of his crimes, leaving behind a disturbing legacy that blurred the line between remorse and performance. After his conviction in 1994, Danny Harold Rolling was sent to Florida State Prison, where he would spend the next 12 years on death row. For most inmates, death row is a place of silence and isolation, a waiting game with little left to do but mark the passing days. But Rolling did not remain idle. Instead, he began producing a strange body of work, songs, poems, drawings, and long, rambling writings that blended confession with performance. Some saw these creations as the outpouring of a man facing mortality. Others dismissed them as yet another act of manipulation by a killer who had long craved attention. In the years leading up to his execution, Rolling granted interviews and even collaborated with a journalist to publish his thoughts. But the most significant revelation came in the form of a handwritten letter he turned over to authorities just before his death. In it, he confessed fully to the Shreveport triple homicide of 1989, the murders of William Grissom, his daughter Julie, and her nephew Sean. While investigators had long suspected his involvement, this final admission closed the case and confirmed that his trail of violence extended beyond Gainesville. It was as if, facing the end, Rolling wanted to ensure his story and his infamy were complete. As his execution date approached, the state of Florida prepared for the final act of justice. On October 25, 2006, the Gainesville Ripper was escorted from his cell to the death chamber. Outside the prison walls, the atmosphere was tense. Family members of the victims gathered quietly, some holding candles, others holding photos of the young lives he had taken. Just yards away, death penalty opponents stood in protest, their chants of mercy clashing with calls for justice from those who had lived through the nightmare of 1990. Television cameras captured every moment, broadcasting live updates to a nation still haunted by Rolling's crimes. Like every condemned inmate in Florida, Danny Rolling was granted the right to a final meal. His choice was telling. Lobster tail, a dish more suited to celebration than reflection, a luxury on the eve of death. To some, it symbolized indulgence to the very end, another sign that Rolling never fully grasped the gravity of what he had done. To others, it was just another detail in a case filled with unsettling contradictions. When asked for his final words, Rolling did not issue an apology to the families whose children he had slaughtered. He did not express remorse or ask for forgiveness. Instead, as the lethal drugs began to flow through his veins, he began to sing. In a low, steady voice, Rolling recited a gospel hymn of his own creation. The refrain repeated over and over, "None greater than thee, O Lord, none greater than thee." For witnesses in the chamber, it was a surreal and haunting moment. Part prayer, part performance, as the man known for his brutality left this world not with words of regret, but with a song that only deepened the unease. At exactly 6:13 p.m. Eastern Time, Danny Harold Rolling was pronounced dead. The Gainesville Ripper's reign of terror had ended, not in violence on the streets, but in the stillness of a sterile execution chamber. For some, it was a moment of long-awaited closure. For others, it was a reminder that true closure may never come when the wounds are carved so deep. What remained certain was that 5 young students had lost their futures, their families had lost their loved ones, and Gainesville would forever carry the scars of one man's darkness. Yet even after his death, the legacy of Danny Rolling lingers, not only in the pain left behind, but in the way his crimes reshaped the community and echoed into the broader culture. As Gainesville tried to heal, the story of the Ripper would live on in books, films, and collective memory, ensuring that the lessons of 1990 would never be forgotten. If you found this documentary powerful and thought-provoking, we'd love to hear your perspective. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know how stories like this impact the way you think about crime, justice, and society. Don't forget to like this video, share it with others who follow true crime, and subscribe to the True Crime Report Network so you never miss our deep dive investigations into the darkest and most important cases in history. Your support helps us continue telling the stories that must never be forgotten.